My book is now published and should be available in Kindle and paperback form. It's probably easiest to find it by Googling it using the title and name, which is I should know this, The Murder of Madam X, The Limeslade Mystery 1929 by Mark John Maguire. There we are, there on the screen. There's absolutely no obligation to read this or buy it, but I'll be absolutely delighted if anyone does, and more delighted still if anyone has anything pleasant to say about it. It's certainly been the result of a great deal of work and effort by me. I will in due course produce an audible version of this for people who prefer to listen to books rather than to read them for whatever reason. But for the time being, it will be just available in paperback and Kindle form because of the work involved. But hopefully I will get round to addressing some of those things later this year, at the latest. But for the time being, now, what I want to do is to read the first chapter, which should give an indication of what this is about, the details of the murder itself, of the characters involved, and should give an indication of whether or not this is the sort of thing that might be of interest to anyone out there. So, without further ado, The Murder of Madam X.
This is Plunch Lane in Limeslade in southwest Wales. Catherine Zeta-Jones lives about 150 metres up ahead on the left. Behind me is the open sea. This is a place of ghosts. At this exact spot, 92 years ago, a woman lay dying. She had been brutally assaulted. When she was asked who her assailant was, she said just one word. Olive Dimick had just returned home from a night at Mumbles cinema with her neighbour Kate Jackson when she heard the screams. The terrible cries were heard by many of the inhabitants of the small colony of bungalows at Limeslade, near Swansea in South Wales. People stopped still, transfixed by the piercing screams of a woman and the long moans which followed and floated across the valley. They lasted for several minutes, and the impression of them for longer. A dog barked in furious accompaniment, and people came slowly out onto the terraces of their bungalows, many with coats hurriedly thrown on over night clothes, to check the icy breeze that whipped in off Limeslade Bay. Paralysis and uncertainty seemed to grip those who listened in the darkness, as though they sought to conjure some rational explanation for the terror they heard in the woman's voice. It was just after 10 o'clock on the evening of Monday, the 4th of February, 1929. Olive Dimick alone, it seems, was not paralysed by inaction. She had not long parted from her friend at the door to her bungalow, and gone inside to remove her hat and coat. After a moment's hesitation, she rushed out by the side door, and ran round to the back of Kate's bungalow, Kenilworth, where the screams seemed to emanate from. There she found Kate Jackson lying on the ground outside the back door, and her husband Thomas bending over her, apparently trying to lift his wife up. "What is the matter?" she asked him. The injured woman's husband said, "Help me pick her up, Dimmy. I don't know what has happened to her." He also said, "Who has done this to you, my dear?" Unable to lift Mrs. Jackson, who was a large woman, together they managed to drag her to the back door and propped her up in the doorway, where she continued to groan in a state of semi-consciousness. It was a dark, moonless night, and Olive went in to fetch a lamp. On her return, she saw that Mrs. Jackson's head and face were streaming with blood. She also noticed that Thomas was in his underwear and socks. She told him to go in and dress, so he went inside to do this. In the meantime, another neighbour, Mrs. Rose Gammon, came to the fence of the property along with Olive's husband, Sidney, and asked if she could assist. Olive went over to speak to her. "Something has frightened Molly," she told her, which was the name by which Mrs. Jackson was known amongst her friends and neighbours. A few minutes later, a now dressed Thomas Jackson joined them. "Shall I fetch a doctor, or can I do anything?" Mrs. Gammon inquired. "It's all right, Mrs. Gammon," Thomas Jackson replied. "I will fetch a doctor if she gets worse." Supposing that all was in hand, and the injuries and their cause was nothing out of the ordinary, both Sidney Dimick and Rose Gammon returned to their homes. Others, who had not ventured beyond their verandas and doorways, retreated indoors, unsettled by what they had heard, but reassured that whatever crisis had occurred had now abated. But it hadn't. Olive and Thomas succeeded in dragging Mrs. Jackson into the scullery, rested her on a mat, and placed a pillow under her head. Mrs. Jackson seemed to revive a little after Olive had washed her wounds and bandaged them, using 4 pillowcases cut into strips, and with some assistance she was able to get to her feet and into the sitting-room to an armchair. In spite of this revival, the wounds were obviously severe. Mrs. Jackson had lost a lot of blood. She was barely conscious, and Olive sent Thomas to call for a doctor. He went to the house of a neighbour, Mrs. Janet Phillips, and asked to use her phone, as his wife had been attacked on the road. Thomas Jackson called a Dr. Taylor of Mumbles, who agreed to come out to see Mrs. Jackson. He told the doctor he would meet him at Boyle's garage in Limeslade, a few doors away from the Jacksons' bungalow, Kenilworth. When he had replaced the receiver, Mrs. Phillips asked Thomas if he had any idea who had attacked Kate, and he said, "No, but she has received threatening letters." Dr. Neil Seddon Taylor arrived 10 minutes later, and having removed the makeshift bandages, he saw at once that Mrs. Jackson was seriously injured. Thomas told him that she had received anonymous letters following an embezzlement trial she had been involved in 2 years previously, and that she had been frightened. Dr. Taylor cut away and then shaved some of Mrs. Jackson's hair with a razor he borrowed from Thomas, and began to insert some stitches into the worst of the wounds to staunch the flow of blood. She appeared to have further regained some of her consciousness during this process, because she complained that the doctor was hurting her. He asked Mrs. Jackson, "What has happened to you, Mrs. Jackson? Who has done this to you?" He asked the question several times during the course of his treatment of her, but she was either incapable of replying, incoherent, or else didn't wish to answer the question. Then suddenly she said one word, apparently in response to the doctor's question. "Gorse," she said. She repeated this word 3 or 4 times. It was the only word she said. Olive and Thomas looked at one another, puzzled. The doctor inquired whether the word meant anything to either of them, but both said it didn't. The doctor then told Thomas Jackson to call the hospital, so that Mrs. Jackson could be admitted for treatment, and also to call a taxi to take her there, and, of course, to inform the police of the matter. Thomas went off to see to this, and he returned to Mrs. Phillips' house, Braeside, again requesting to use the phone to call a taxi. On this occasion, responding to a query by Mrs. Phillips as to who would attack his wife, he had said he didn't know, but asked, "Do you think anyone would do it for money?" When he returned, the doctor asked if he had called the hospital, and he said he had forgotten. The doctor told him he must do this, as the hospital would not admit his wife unless they had prior notification of her arrival. This time Jackson went to John Skidmore's bungalow, Merivale, and called to him from outside, asking if he could use his phone. He told Skidmore, in response to his query as to what had happened, "Oh, it's that old affair. My wife has been attacked on her way home from the pictures." The taxi had arrived by the time Thomas had made his way back to Kenilworth bungalow, and between them, the doctor, Jackson, and the driver, Kenneth Peachy, succeeded in getting Mrs. Jackson into the rear of the taxi. Thomas travelled to the hospital with his wife Kate, wrapped in 2 blankets on the floor, her head supported between his knees, and the doctor followed them in his own car. Upon arrival at Swansea General Hospital, the doctor looked in at the window of the cab and asked Jackson how his wife was. "She's sleeping comfortably," he replied. The police were again mentioned, and Jackson said he would inform them. A nurse, Winifred Davis, was on duty that night when Kate Jackson was admitted to the hospital. After a doctor applied some more stitching to her other head wounds in the casualty room, she put Kate into bed without undressing her, due to the nature of her injuries. It was not until the early hours of the morning that the nurse removed Mrs. Jackson's purple-coloured pullover and other blood-stained clothes and placed them in a locker beside the bed. Jackson remained at the hospital for only a short time, and then left with the taxi driver. "I think we will be setting back now," he said. When the hospital night porter, David James, went to take a statement from those present to write a report of the incident in accordance with hospital practice, he found Thomas Jackson had already left. The porter informed Nurse Davis of this, who told him to call the police and to report that a woman had arrived at the hospital with serious head injuries. A desk sergeant took the call at Swansea Central Police Station a little after 3 a.m., and from inquiries made, he was able to establish that the doctor was Dr. Neil Taylor of Mumbles, whom he called. Dr. Taylor gave him details of the incident and the address at which Mrs. Jackson had been injured. Sergeant Trevor Sidney Griffiths of Swansea Borough Police arrived at Swansea Hospital in the early hours of the 5th of February. He heard of the incident from the hospital porter, and upon being told of the nature of her injuries, he informed his superior, Inspector Edward Thomas, who arrived at the hospital soon afterwards. Inspector Thomas travelled with Sergeant Griffiths and a Sergeant Thomas Davis to Limeslade in a police ambulance vehicle. By now it was nearly 5 a.m., and Inspector Thomas noticed a light was on in the right-hand window of Kenilworth bungalow. He knocked on the door several times. A dog was barking from within, and at length Thomas Jackson called out to ask who it was. "The police," said Inspector Thomas. "We want to see you a minute." Jackson opened the door in a nightshirt, and Inspector Thomas said to him, "Are you aware that your wife is unconscious at the hospital and has some cuts on her head?" Jackson said he didn't think she was that bad, but that he would be happy to tell them all he knew as soon as he got dressed. While Inspector Thomas took a statement from Jackson, Sergeant Trevor Griffiths examined the scene, noted a large pool of blood, approximately 2 feet, 60 centimetres in diameter, some 8 feet, 2.4 metres from the back door, various traces of blood within the bungalow, and a smudge of blood on the outer panel of the back door. No signs of footmarks or of a struggle could be discerned in the ground outside, which was soft. He found large fragments of glass in the pool of blood, which appeared to be from a broken flagon bottle, a quart-sized, broad-based bottle with a handle near its top, and a large stone was in its centre. He collected the fragments in a small basket. In the lumber room to the rear of the property he observed a coat, which was heavily stained with blood, and in the scullery other items of women's underclothing, similarly stained. In his statement to Inspector Thomas, Jackson said that he worked as a fishmonger, and had arrived home at around 5 o'clock on the previous afternoon. His wife had left the bungalow at 6 o'clock with Mrs. Dimick, their next-door neighbour, that the 2 women had visited the cinema at Mumbles, and that having put their 6-year-old adopted daughter, Betty into her cot at around 7:30 p.m. He had himself half undressed and gone to bed. Here he had read a little before dozing. He said he had been awoken by an unusual noise at about 10:45 p.m, and the dog had begun to bark. He had immediately dressed and went to the rear of the bungalow to see what the unusual noise was. He found his wife lying on the floor outside the rear door, and Mrs. Dimick running from 5 yards away, 4.5 meters, towards her. His wife was bleeding from the head. Mrs. Dimick lifted her up and said, "Molly has been hurt," he told the inspector. He had run to telephone for a doctor, and when the doctor had arrived, he had asked her who had caused her injuries, in response to which she gave a name he couldn't quite catch. He had gone with his wife to hospital in Peachy's taxi, and, after getting her into the hospital, Dr. Taylor had told him to go home. "I really don't know who my wife is," he added. "She is a mystery to me. She said she was born in India. I married her in Cardiff." As the grey flat light of morning spread across the colony of Limeslade, which consisted largely of a mixture of wooden bungalows and a few stone-built properties, neighbours woke to learn of the attack. The bungalows in Plunch Lane buzzed with the news of the assault on Kate Jackson, and the place was a hive of activity, with many uniformed and plain-clothes police present. Rose Gammon, who lived at Sea View Bungalow, at the top of a stretch of sloping land, 46 yards, about 42 metres, above Kenilworth, and who had come down to the fence the previous evening, saw the police activity and went to inquire as to its cause. It was here that she learned of the attack on Mrs. Jackson and of its seriousness. She had known, of course, that there had been an incident or some kind of accident, but she had not understood it to be of such a serious nature. It caused a great stir in the small community of Limeslade, whose very closeness and remoteness on the picturesque Mumbles headland seemed to insulate it from such violent events. Mrs. Olive Dimick, the Jacksons' next-door neighbour, who lived at number 8 Webbons Field, Limeslade, also spoke to Inspector Thomas, and confirmed Jackson's statement concerning her visit to the Mumbles cinema with Mrs. Jackson. She told him that they had returned home via Thistlebourne Lane, arriving at their bungalows at about 10 p.m. They had said good night, and Mrs. Jackson went round to the rear of her bungalow to the back door, while she had entered her own by the side door. She said, "I had taken my things off when I heard screams which I thought emanated from opposite the road where people named Carter live, who frequently quarrel. I thought I recognized the voice, and I ran out, as it was Mrs. Jackson's voice I heard. I went to the rear of the house and saw Mr. Jackson, who was half-dressed, trying to lift her up." She also said, "There was a motor car opposite her house when we arrived home, without lights on." She hadn't drawn her friend's attention to the car's presence, she said, because she knew her to be afraid of strange cars. One had been outside the bungalow on the previous Friday, and Mrs. Jackson had been afraid. Superintendent Harry Fox, head of the Mumbles Division of Swansea Borough Police, arrived a little later in the morning, together with Detective Inspector Frederick William Gubb and the Chief Constable, Captain Thomas Rawson. They noted the large pool of blood at the rear, but could discern no signs of a struggle. They also noted a large bloodstain on the rear door, about 5 inches by 3 inches in size, that's about 13 centimetres by 8 centimetres, which appeared to be consistent with that of a person's head having come into contact with it. Inspector Gubb noted much evidence of blood in the scullery, especially on 2 rugs and on the linoleum they covered, and saw pillow slips and petticoats on the floor, and a cloth which appeared to have been used to wipe up blood. Gubb found a close-fitting coney seal hat with bloodstains on it on a mangle in the scullery, and noted the presence of many other blood-stained items. Officers were also surprised at the closeness exhibited between Mrs. Dimick, Dimmy, and Thomas Jackson. Further statements concerning the circumstances of the attack were given by Thomas Jackson to Detective Inspector Gubb, and he also gave details of his wife's life and background. In this, Jackson proved loquacious. He said he could not help at all in the matter of the attack itself, as he had seen nothing and heard only a thud and a moan before finding his wife unconscious. But he said his wife had enemies whom she lived in dread of, and at times locked herself in the house. She very rarely went out. She spent most of her time in bed writing novels. She had told him she was the well-known author Ethel M. Dell, and he believed her. He knew very little of his wife. She was a mystery to him, and had told him she was the youngest daughter of the Duke of Abercorn. Gubb showed him a birth certificate, which stated she was Kate Atkinson, born in Ray, Lancashire, which he had discovered in an unlocked box of papers on the living-room table. In reply, Jackson said his wife had told him she had bought the certificate in 1916 off a girl who was emigrating to Australia. It was not hers. He also said that he and his wife lived very happily together and never quarrelled. At midday, detectives John Wright and Gwilym Cornock took possession of the clothes Jackson had been wearing the previous night. Jackson made a further statement at Mumbles police station at 3 p.m. on the 5th of February, saying he had gone on his rounds on the morning of the 4th of February. In the afternoon he had gone to fetch fish from the market for the following day, and he had returned home at 5:15 p.m., where he, Kate and Betty had tea. Then his wife left for the cinema with Mrs. Dimick at 6 p.m., not returning until 10 p.m., when he had been awoken by a thud and a strange noise. He said the reason he had not called the police was because, "I thought the doctor would attend to that. He promised me on his word of honour that he would do everything that was necessary." It was otherwise a slow news day. It was reported that His Majesty King George V, who was suffering from pneumonia and whose condition was causing concern, would be travelling by private ambulance to Craigwell House at Bognor to recover. Mrs. Jackson, also indisposed in the Llywelyn ward at Swansea Hospital, had X-rays taken of her head, which revealed a fracture at the base of the skull. News of the attack outside Kenilworth Bungalow spread quickly. The local and Welsh newspapers naturally became interested in the brutal assault on Kate Jackson in the isolated Mumbles headland. They were quick to note the incongruity of the attack and of the heavy police presence, while the picturesque surroundings suggested absolute tranquillity. The incident might have escaped wider press attention had it not been for its being a quiet day for news. But when it was learned that Kate Jackson was the mysterious Madam X, a woman who had given evidence at a sensational embezzlement hearing in London 2 years earlier, and on whose behalf a man named Harrison had defrauded his employers of a very large sum of money, an army of press reporters and photographers descended on the small community of Limeslade from across Britain. The Jacksons' 6-year-old adopted daughter Betty was often seen at the windows of the bungalow, looking out at the reporters and police, and appeared to be mystified by all the activity. Apparently she was told nothing of what had happened or where her mother had gone, although it was clear that she had been awakened and much disturbed by the events of the previous evening. Thomas Jackson gave several interviews during the following days to members of the press, as did Olive Dimick, and this certainly helped to fuel their interest in the matter. "On the night of the affair I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a scream and then a dog bark. I went to the door and found my wife on the ground, but raised up, as if trying to get up to open the door. She had apparently crawled about 7 feet. She was bleeding from the head, and Dr. Taylor was called, and she was taken to hospital. Dr. Taylor told me, when he called, that he met a motor car dashing away without lights when he was on his way up," he told the Daily Post. However, the Daily Post also noted that Dr. Taylor stated that he met a motor when he was going to the bungalow, but the lights were on. Thomas Jackson said his wife had told him she was the youngest daughter of a duke, and he told reporters she had bought a false identity as Kate Atkinson because she was afraid of her life of being taken back to her family. He spoke of his wife receiving anonymous letters, and of her threatening to shoot anyone who tried to take her away. "I soon became more and more convinced that my wife married me because she wanted me to protect her from someone," he told a reporter. "But she never told me her real secrets, and I do not know today who she really is. It was my wife who bought the bungalow at Mumbles. She chose it because of its remoteness. She wanted to be away from everyone. Whenever there was a strange car in the neighbourhood, she seemed terrified, And only a few days before the attack on her, she said, "There has been a big car opposite, and I am nervous of it." At one time, he added, "my wife kept a revolver and ammunition, and I have heard her say that she would shoot anybody who came to try to take her away." Olive Dimick also followed a similar line in the interview she gave, telling reporters of Mrs. Jackson's fears and that she would not tell me the cause of her alarm, but lately this has become intensified. On Friday, a saloon car was standing on the road not far from the Jacksons' bungalow, Kenilworth. It was at night, and all the lights were extinguished. On the following day, Mrs. Jackson told me that she had been so alarmed the previous night that she had locked herself in. The press dutifully reported all of this, and the case quickly became known and almost exclusively referred to as either the Madam X mystery or the Limeslade mystery. The police took statements from neighbours and interviewed many witnesses from across Limeslade in the course of the ensuing days, and they consulted with Scotland Yard in view of Kate Jackson's numerous associations with London and other regions of Britain. But they could find no sign of there having been a stranger in the area on the night of the attack. Heavy rain across West Wales hampered their investigation, and the unmade road of Plunch Lane quickly became a quagmire with all the activity. No vehicle could proceed above Boyle's garage, some 70 yards, that's 64 metres, from Kenilworth, and as the ground became further churned up, vehicles had to be parked on Mumbles Road on the seafront, some 300 yards, or 274 metres, away. Meanwhile, the police kept permanent guard on Mrs. Jackson and waited at her bedside each day in the hope of her recovering sufficiently to tell them who her assailant was. Each day the police gave statements to the press indicating that Kate's condition was improving and that they hoped to be in a position to speak to her soon. She regained consciousness fitfully, was clearly improving, and on occasions she was quite lucid. But when asked who had attacked her, she either became confused or declined to say. The Daily Post reported on Thursday, the 7th of February, that quite a stir was created when Mrs. Jackson attempted to get out of bed. The nurses on duty had to get assistance to restrain her, as she is a powerfully built woman. By the end of the week, Kate Jackson's wounds were beginning to heal. She was sitting up and even removing her bandages herself. The doctors had full confidence that her recovery was only a matter of time, and on Saturday the 9th of February, Dr. Arthur Robinson Thomas of Swansea Hospital informed police that she was sufficiently conscious to be interviewed gently. It was reported by the Daily Post that she was able to speak quite rationally, and this is confirmed in the Metropolitan Police reports of the matter. Detective Inspector Gubb and Superintendent Fox went to her bedside at around noon on Saturday for this purpose. Mrs. Jackson seemed alert and able to understand their purpose in attending her. They began to take a statement from her, but as soon as she was asked about the attack, she assumed a dumb attitude. According to the police report, they could glean nothing from her, and they had to abandon the attempt. Perhaps surprisingly, given that Mrs. Jackson had regained full consciousness, it was reported that Mr. Jackson visited his wife at the hospital on Saturday afternoon. He did not, however, remain long, and it is understood that Mrs. Jackson made no statement. He remained in conversation with Detective Franklin, who has been keeping watch at the woman's bedside for the past 4 days, for the greater part of the time. As he left, a number of visitors regarded him curiously, and Mr. Jackson was obviously ill at ease. Then, late in the morning, on Sunday the 10th of February, there was a sudden flurry of activity at the hospital. Inspector Gubb arrived, and the Chief Constable, Thomas Rawson, followed. Thomas Jackson was brought to the hospital by Mumbles police. The press was agog. It was reported that Mrs. Jackson was about to give a statement. Then a magistrate, Councillor John Lewis, J.P., who had been brought direct from a chapel service he was attending by Superintendent Fox, arrived. The magistrate's clerk, Mr. Thorpe, also arrived in a great hurry, carrying a bundle of papers. It was now learned that Mrs. Jackson's condition had worsened overnight, and an attempt was to be made to take a dying deposition from her. The men hurried to the ward, but they were absent for only a few minutes. Mr. Thorpe was the first to return. He looked somewhat bewilderedly at reporters and said, "She's gone." The daily reports of her recovery had, it seems, been optimistic. Kate Jackson died just after midday on the 10th of February 1929, 6 days after sustaining her injuries at Kenilworth Bungalow in Limeslade. She had made no statement and given no intimation as to who had attacked her. The matter of the assault on the woman known to the press as Madam X was now a murder inquiry. Chief Constable Rawson appeared and confirmed to reporters that no deposition had been taken, and when asked what the next step would be, he hesitated and shrugged. "There will be a post-mortem," he said at last. Thomas Jackson then appeared, his eyes red from crying. All eyes were on him. He seemed dazed by the suddenness of the catastrophe that had engulfed him. "This is a heavy blow to you," ventured a reporter. "Yes," he muttered, and then, turning to the chief constable with great emotion, he said, "Take me home."